such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is about a prankster father who faked his own baby's kidnapping. Or did he? An infamous case you might have heard of, but no one is exactly sure what happened. Many questions remain and theories arise. Was the man convicted and executed for this crime innocent? Was this really an inside job? It's a case that reminds me of Madeleine McCann and JonBenet Ramsey, and that's never what you want to hear. I also want to thank 2 Dots for sponsoring this video and allowing me to continue creating these videos. Now 2 Dots is actually a puzzle game where you can travel through these really beautiful places and settings to collect different collectibles, and you are also connecting the dots on the way. Now that is my favorite part of the actual game, is the puzzles that you are trying to compete against. There are also weekly events like scavenger hunts and many more. Now 2 Dots makes it super easy to actually learn from level to level and feel like you're actually getting better and that you're capable of it, and it's not one that you will put down because it's too frustrating, or also put down because you're bored and it's too easy. It's the perfect in between as far as challenging. 2 Dots is something that I've been clicking on literally every night right before I go to sleep to just get rid of the thoughts in my head. So if you want to download, make sure to do so down below. It is free to download on iOS and Android. Now let's get back to the story. It was 1932 in New Jersey, and the Lindbergh family lived in Hopewell. This was Charles and Anne and their 20-month-old son, Charlie. Now, he was really Charles Jr., but many people did call him Charlie. Their home was in Highfields, a 390-acre estate in a very remote area. Now, Charles and Anne were both very successful aviators, which is how they would afford this home. 5 years prior, Charles had actually piloted the Spirit of St. Louis across the Atlantic. Now, it was actually a competition put on by a New York hotel manager, Raymond Ortega, and he was offering $25,000 for the first person to do this. 6 people had tried this sort of flight and had never returned. Now, Charles was able to get 9 St. Louis investors to back him and give him the $15,000 that he needed to go ahead and have this plane built. It had to be a special plane that couldn't be too heavy, and so he went to Ryan Airlines and he had them rebuild the Ryan M2 aircraft in a 2-month period, and he ended up naming it the Spirit of St. Louis for his investors. Now, Charles then made a test run from San Diego to Long Island and made this in only 21 hours. After some rest, he was ready for the official flight, and he would take off at Roosevelt Field in New York with 1,000 people watching him. He was in a single-engine monoplane and had flown alone for the non-stop flight from New York City to Paris. At only 25, on May 21st of 1927, he accomplished the first solo transatlantic flight between 2 major city hubs. This took 33 hours and 30 minutes for him to touch down in Le Bourget airfield in Paris. There was a huge crowd awaiting him and celebrating him, and he would end up going aboard the U.S. Navy cruiser USS Memphis with his plane so they could take him back home, because he was exhausted after this 33-hour trip that he had to stay awake for the whole time. Now, this not only gave him fame, but also awarded him the Legion of Honor, the highest French order of merit by the President of France. He was also given the Distinguished Flyer Cross by President Calvin Coolidge, and from then on he became known as Lucky Lindy, as he had fought off ice, fog, hallucinations, and sleep deprivations to make it. This successful aviation trip was a huge awakening for the commercial aviation community, who realized that they could make these trips and make them faster and farther away, ultimately making them more money. This is when the Lindenberg boom began, and there were dozens of companies creating airlines, and there were more applications for pilots than ever before. Charles had even said, "There were times in an airplane when it seemed I had escaped mortality to look down on Earth like a god." Now, while many adored Charles and what he did for the future of traveling, some didn't think that he really deserved to be praised as he was being. Some believed that he was being looked up to, like he had walked on water and not just flown over it. Once he returned home to his mother's house, he had so many supporters and reporters in his front yard. He would do interviews, and not only that, but he realized he wouldn't have trouble getting a job because he had already been offered several positions. He was also promoted to the rank of colonel in the Air Corps of the U.S. Army as well. He would also become the first Man of the Year in Times Magazine, which is now called Person of the Year. And since he was 25, he was also the youngest ever given that honor until 91 years later in 2019 when Greta Thunberg, at 16 years old, took it over. Aviators would claim nothing was more impressive than this flight. Even when they would later walk on the moon, it didn't even come close. This was said to be because in the 20s, people were so innocent and religious that they almost felt that Charles was this man from God that was sent from God to do this. And his wife Anne was actually just as impressive. She had been taught by Charles how to fly and became the first woman to ever get a U.S. glider pilot license. She would often go with Charles to explore, and she was the radio operator and the co-pilot and extremely good at it as well. During their marriage, they would make flights from Africa to South America and from North America to Asia and Europe. This couple had met the same year that Charles had actually flown on this non-stop flight from New York to Paris, and her father had been his financial advisor. They all went to Mexico to celebrate, and that is when Anne and Charles met. She was 4 years younger than him. She was a bit shy at first when they were introduced. She was still actually in college, and she knew that this man in front of her was quite successful and deemed a hero by many. She was almost smitten from the very beginning. In fact, she wrote in her diary, "He is taller than anyone else. You can see his head in a moving crowd, and you notice his glance where it turns as though it were keener, clearer, and brighter than anyone else's, lit with a more intense fire. What could I say to this boy? Anything I might say would be trivial and superficial, like pink frosting flowers. I felt the whole world before this to be frivolous, superficial." It turned out, though, that Charles was just as interested as Anne, and 2 years later, they were married. Only a year after that, Charles Jr., or Charlie, was born on Anne's 25th birthday, and they quickly became the most famous family in the world. Everyone adored Charlie. It was as if he was almost royalty, and that would make his kidnapping even more disturbing for the entire world. You see, the home that they had moved into, the remote Highlands home, was still under construction at this time. So most of that time during the week, the family were in Inglewood at Anne's mother's estate. She lived in an even more luxurious and enormous home than their own. You see, Anne's father had been in the U.S. Senate before his own death, and they had enough money to employ at least 20 servants. It definitely wasn't slumming it for Charles, Anne, and Charlie when they had to live there while their home was built. It was more like a 5-star getaway. That weekend, though, the family would go back to their Highfields estate as usual. They did this on the weekends, but they would end up staying a bit longer than they ever had before. You see, Charlie had a cold, and they really didn't want to be traveling with him when he didn't feel good, and so they decided to stay a few extra days, and they asked some of these servants from their mother's home to come to their own home for the time being to help out with the child. On Tuesday, March 1st of 1932, Charlie would be put to bed around 7 p.m. by his 24-year-old nurse or nanny named Betty Gow and his own mother. He was in this wool sleeping suit, and he also had his thumb guard so he didn't suck his thumb, and he was tucked into his blanket, which they would then put safety pins around to attach him to the bed to make sure he was secured. Anne would go and take her bath, and 30 minutes later, Betty would go and check on Charlie, and she found him sleeping. So she kind of just went on to do her evening things, and around 10 p.m. is when Betty would be going to sleep. So she decided to check on Charlie one last time. However, she found that he was no longer in bed. Now, she figured that maybe Anne had gotten up and decided to take Charlie out of bed, so she wasn't really worried until Anne came out of the bathroom and was alone. So then she went to Charles to see if maybe Charles had him, but upon seeing that Charlie was nowhere near him, she began to tell them that their son was missing. Charles ran to the bedroom where Charlie was nowhere to be found, and that is when what he would find next would terrify everyone. There was an envelope on the open windowsill. Now, it was also a horribly written letter, but it said, "Dear sir, have $50,000 ready, $25,000 and $20 bills, $15,000 and $10 bills, and $10,000 and $5 bills. After 2 to 4 days, we will inform you where to deliver the money. We warn you for making anything public or for notify the police. The child is in gut care." Now, as you can tell, it was very hard to read that because most of the things were misspelled, and they also put the $sign after the amount of money, which led them to believe that this was not an American who had kidnapped Charlie. At the bottom of this letter was a drawing of sorts. There were 2 connected blue circles around a red circle. It was basically a Venn diagram with a red dot in the middle. There was an actual hole in the paper through that red dot, as well as on both sides of the outside of the Venn diagram. It appeared to be a completely random picture that had been done, and no one really knew the meaning of it. Now, the family's butler named Ollie did end up calling the Hopewell Police Department once he was informed of what was going on. And as soon as, they had heard, a teletype went out to all of the police that said, "Colonel Lindbergh's baby kidnapped from Lindbergh home in Hopewell, New Jersey, sometime between 7:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. this date. Baby is 19 months old and a boy, and dressed in a sleeping suit. Request that all cars be investigated by police patrols. Authority State Police, Trenton, New Jersey, 10:46 p.m. Now, once this was sent out by the police, the newspapers took this and ran with it like crazy. Now, Charlie was being called the Eaglet, and front pages were written about this kidnapping almost immediately. It was written that Charlie was 29 inches, 27 to 30 pounds, with blonde curly hair and dark blue eyes. He had a deep dimple in the middle of his chin, and everyone around this community and around really the world were looking for Charlie. Meanwhile, Nurse Betty and Butler Ollie said that Charles had immediately grabbed his gun and went looking outside and inside of the home to find his son. Everyone inside the home said that they had not heard a single cry. Charles said that he did hear a crack outside when he was just, reading downstairs when Charlie was in bed, but it sounded almost like a tree branch broke, and it was so windy outside that he didn't think much of it. Now, outside, there was a ladder that was nearby the nursery window, but it was almost in 3 pieces as though it had been broken. There were also impressions of the ladder in the ground where it had been pushed into, as well as shavings on the home, the side of the home where the nursery was, where the window was open, that were shown that a ladder had been resting against it. They found Charlie's blanket lying there, as well as a chisel and what appeared to be a footprint, but wasn't actually going to be helpful in measuring a shoe size because it appeared as though this person was wearing socks. Now, at 10:25 p.m., the same time when the butler Ollie was calling Hopewell Police, Charles was calling New Jersey State Police. They actually believed it was a prank call, and they hung up and they recalled the Lindbergh residence to see if it was the same voice. And Charles once again said his son was kidnapped, and they then said the men were on the way. Hopewell Police obviously arrived first and quickly found a ladder on the property, the one that was broken up, and the Lindberghs said that it didn't belong to them. It appeared to almost be a homemade ladder and was thought to be broken once somebody was trying to go up or going back down. Inside the nursery, there were traces of mud from the ground outside, but there were no bloodstains or fingerprints. Now, Corporal Frank Kelly actually took the ransom letter to test for forensic evidence. He was an expert in crime scene analyst, and meanwhile, the Hopewell Police and the state police searched every square inch of this home, inside and outside, and Norman Schwarzkopf was the lead investigator in this case, but he wouldn't be in charge for long. Now, Ollie, Betty, and the housekeeper and cook named Elsie, who was also Ollie's wife, were all questioned because they were in the home. Now, not only were those in the Lindbergh home questioned, but also the employees of Anne's mother's estate as well. Every detail of their work lives and personal lives were exposed, and investigators needed to know exactly where everyone was from 8 to 10 p.m. that night. Now, the only real information besides what I've told you that they could obtain from these people was that a Dodge sedan was seen near the home a day prior. It was unknown who this person was, and of course, this was not just a place where cars drove by, it was very remote. It was also being theorized by investigators that this could have been done by 2 or more intruders. It was unlikely that it was just done by one person. Now, due to the lack of adult fingerprints or shoe prints, it was theorized that the intruders had worn gloves or some type of cloth over their shoes or had just worn socks. Witnesses such as Betty said that she had been in the nursery, likely leaving fingerprints behind. Yet there were no adult fingerprints, no fingerprints at all found in this nursery, as though it had all been wiped down. Corporal Frank Kelly, who had taken the ransom letter, then informed everyone that this ransom letter had been written by only one person, and that didn't automatically eliminate that there was more than one intruder, but of course there was only one person who wrote the letter. Now, the person who wrote this letter was not believed to know English very well. It was not their first language, and they were believed to be German, and they hadn't been in America long either. Now, at this point, the profile of one or more of the intruders was created, and it was believed that this had to be an antisocial loner dissatisfied with life. Now, 3 days later, on March 4th, a woman named Evelyn Walsh McLean believed she could get Charlie back alive. She had gone to this known private detective named Gaston B. Means, who claimed to have been invited to the actual kidnapping but declined. He said he would have no problem getting in contact with these kidnappers because they were actually his friends. Now, a day later, he told Evelyn that they told him for $100,000 she could get the child and he would be alive. However, once she handed over the money, she didn't see Charlie. Gaston just kept putting it off, saying that he was trying to negotiate with the kidnappers. He was calling them the Fox. And Evelyn eventually realized that she had been duped, that this private detective was actually a con man, and she requested the money back, as well as the extra money she had given him for expenses. Now, back at the Lindbergh home, Charles was frantically asking any of his friends in high places for help. They were trying to get the kidnappers to start negotiating with the family, and this actually worked because 5 days later, on March 6th, Charles received the second ransom note. Now, it was postmarked Brooklyn, New York. 2 days after Charlie had been kidnapped, the kidnappers now demanded $70,000 instead of $50,000. The third ransom note would be sent after the Lindbergh family's lawyer, Henry Breckenridge, would ask the kidnappers if they could appoint an intermediary to go between the Lindbergh family and the kidnappers, but this was denied. But then a random 71-year-old New York City retired school principal and professor named John F. Condon, who didn't know the family but adored Charles Lindbergh, decided to offer to be a stranger intermediary between the Lindbergh family and the kidnappers because he didn't know them and they hadn't chosen him. And he put this in a newspaper, the Bronx newspaper, 4 days later on March 8th. He also wrote he would pay an additional $1,000 to do so. And he was a man known to write in the Bronx newspaper about different things, about his thoughts, about his opinions, just kind of ranting. So this wasn't strange for him to do, but he was inserting himself in a criminal investigation where he wasn't asked to do so. Meanwhile, the governor of Trenton, New Jersey, held a police conference, not a press conference, but he asked all of the different forms of authority around this case to come together to decide what to do next. Now, they were told that they needed to work on their time off, to sacrifice their sleep, to devote all of their attention to this case. Private investigators were also placed on the case by the Lindbergh family. And due to all this media attention, J. Edgar Hoover's new Bureau of Information wanted to help. Now, this was the beginning of what would become the FBI we know today. J. Edgar Hoover actually arrived in Hopewell, New Jersey at the Lindbergh residence, hoping to be able to give any sort of help that was needed to the Lindberghs. But they were turned away by the Lindberghs and by investigators due to jurisdiction, because they were not yet the federal government and could not take over jurisdiction. And so the investigators said that they didn't want them there. Initially, they were told that they were at the disposal of the state and would be only the coordinating agency. Regardless, though, they did decide to go ahead and put a watch on all banks in New York for the ransom money when it would come in. The lack of use of this new bureau would be something that for the rest of time, many would regret. Now, only a day after the retired principal, John Condon, placed the ad in the paper, he received the fourth ransom note. The kidnappers agreed that he could be the intermediary for his fee. Investigators, though, then had an even better idea of where Charlie could be because this had all occurred in the Bronx newspaper. The kidnappers could have only read what John said in the Bronx newspaper, and this was not something that millions of people read. It was a readership of about 150,000 in that area, and it was likely that Charlie was in that area as well. Now, at this point, Charles and Anne had no choice but to accept the help of this random man named John because he had put himself in the middle of it. John had actually gone to their home and slept on the nursery floor, and he proceeded to touch everything in the crime scene as well as take 2 of the safety pins that were left in the crib. Within the day, in order to contact the kidnappers, John wrote an ad in the New York American, this time under the code of Jofsy, which was just the actual pronunciation of his own initials, which were JFC. The ad read, "Money is ready, Jofsy." This wouldn't be the end though, because it would be what was referred to as a cat and mouse game. And a day later, on March 11th, John would be called by an anonymous person. However, due to him not being home, his wife did take a message, and she said that this man over the phone said, "I saw your ad in the New York American. Stay home at night and you will hear from us." His wife said that this man had a very guttural voice with a strong German accent, and John then received a letter the next night at 8:30 p.m. This did not just come in his mailbox, though. He actually got a doorbell ring, and he went to find that a taxi cab driver was staring at him and handing him a note. Now, this note claimed that another note would be given at the meeting that night, and they gave directions to the meeting. It had the exact same symbol as the other notes, which wasn't told to the public at this time, so this seemed to be something that investigators could tell was really from the kidnappers because no one else knew that this was being placed on the letters. There were also dimensions of a wooden box that John was supposed to build to hold the ransom money. Investigators found this taxi driver and spoke to him and found that he was Joseph Perrone, and he said he had been given a note by a stranger who hailed a cab just south of Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx. He told him to deliver this letter and gave him $1 to do so. So on March 13th, John asked his friend, who was a professional boxer, to take him to this meeting, and the directions actually took them to a hot dog stand where they found more directions that led them underneath a rock. At the rock, they found more directions that led them to the Woodland Cemetery. Investigators did not follow John nor his friend, nor did they have eyes on the meeting place. They were nowhere near what was going on. They would learn everything that happened that night from the mouth of John the next day. Now, he claimed that when he went to the cemetery, he was walking around, and through a gate, a man would come with a white handkerchief and begin waving it around. John said that the man said, "Have you got the money?" in a German voice. John said that he appeared to be around 25 years old, 5'9", medium build, smooth shaven with a small mouth, deep-set eyes, and high cheekbones. He was also said to have some sort of abnormality with his thumbs. Before anything else could happen, John said that there was a loud sound, and this man got spooked and vaulted himself over the fence and began running. The guard walked over to John, and John told him that the man who ran was with him, that everything was okay. So then John ran after this man and found himself in Van Cortlandt Park in the trees and ended up grabbing this man and saying that he should be ashamed of himself for running. They then allegedly sat down on a bench together where this man told him that his name was also John. So at this point, the first John was calling this John Cemetery John. When Cemetery John asked him for the money, John told him he needed proof of life. Cemetery John then said in his German accent, "What if the baby is dead? Would I burn if the baby is dead?" But then he assured him that Charlie was still alive. John then showed Cemetery John the safety pins he had taken from the crib and asked Cemetery John what they were. Now, Cemetery John said that they were the fastenings that the blankets had on them to the mattress in the nursery. John immediately knew that this was in fact the kidnapper because no one else would know this information. An hour later, Cemetery John said that he would send John Charlie's sleeping suit for proof that he was the kidnapper. And 3 days later, on March 16th, John would receive that package wrapped in brown paper, and he also received the 7th ransom note. The kidnapper was complaining in that note that he had to pay $3 for the package to be mailed, and John then alerted the Lindberghs, who would come over and open the package themselves. Charles actually had to disguise himself because the media attention was so crazy at this time, and when they opened the package, they found that it was in fact the wool sleeping suit. But Charles immediately noticed that it had been cleaned, and this worried everyone involved. John then placed another ad in the newspaper saying that he would pay the $3 for the postage, and he said, "I accept. Money is ready. John, your package is delivered and is okay. Direct me, Jofsy." John didn't actually have the money for the ransom at this time. It would be later that day that the Lindbergh's lawyer would come over with $50,000, and John would take this to the bank where JP Morgan and Company would then pay the remaining $20,000. Now, the banknote serial numbers were recorded by the U.S. Treasury, and everything was ready to go. They would be able to track this money if the kidnapper tried to use it. However, at this point, the kidnappers went silent. There was no answers in letters, in the newspaper, and John was panicking, as well as the Lindberghs, and he began to put many ads in the newspaper hoping to get an answer. And 5 long days later, on March 21st, John finally got another letter. This letter claimed that this kidnapping had been planned for a year. It said, "There's absolutely no fear about the child. All is well." Yet it also asked for the $70,000 up front. John wanted to ask for proof of life in the next letter he sent, but the Lindberghs ended up saying they didn't think it was a good idea for the safety of Charlie to push the kidnappers, and so they simply agreed to these terms. On March 29th, 28 days since Charlie had vanished, his nurse, Betty, would be on the estate walking around near the entrance when she found one of Charlie's thumb guards. Then yet another ransom note came, and this time the kidnappers said that they wanted $100,000. And the 10th note, a meeting was set up for the following night. The Lindberghs believed they were finally close to Charlie, even if it was costing them $100,000. But it would be in the 11th note that another taxi driver delivered to John that the meeting location would be given. Now, this was at 3225 East Tremont Avenue in the Bronx in front of a greenhouse. John and the family's lawyer went to work with putting the money into bundles. $50,000 was put in this wooden box, and $20,000 was just in a bundle. And Charles actually prepped with them and then drove John to this location with a revolver in his jacket. At the greenhouse, under another rock, was the directions to a St. Raymond's cemetery. So John left the ransom money in the car and then was called over to this cemetery by Cemetery John, the same man who he had met before. This man refused to show the baby, and so John refused to give him the money. By the end, Cemetery John agreed that $50,000 would be plenty. However, this was actually the exact opposite of what John was supposed to do. He was not supposed to negotiate down the ransom money. He was actually supposed to give him all of that money, because the more money that this kidnapper had, the more likely it was that they would find him through the serial numbers. Cemetery John wrote a receipt and brought the address for baby Charlie in another letter. And so John brought him the money, and John was told not to open that letter for another 6 hours. But they waited only a few moments after Cemetery John left to rip it open. Inside this note, the kidnappers claimed that Charlie was on a boat named Nellie near Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. It was said to be between Horse Neck Beach and Gay Head near Elizabeth Island. But the entire time, through these 13 letters that were sent, they continued to write like they did not know English very well. It was very hard to read. And even on this one, boat was spelled bode. The note said that Charlie was being cared for by 2 people who had nothing to do with the kidnapping and didn't know about it. Charles was driving, and he then headed immediately to a house where Treasury agents were waiting. And they told John that because of his description that he had given of this Cemetery John, they had come up with this sketch. They believed he was also a German carpenter who lived in the Bronx. Now, some investigators did go to Massachusetts, but they found nothing. They didn't find any boats named Nellie. They also did a second search and did not locate the baby. The serial numbers of the bills given to Cemetery John were given to banks all over the world and put in newspapers so that someone would recognize it if this man used it in order to purchase anything at all, but nothing was being flagged. Now, something that the public was never told was that Charlie had 2 overlapping toes on his right foot. Investigators and family members decided to keep this to themselves in order to tell who actually had Charlie. If they were able to say that Charlie had these 2 toes that were overlapping, they would know that this was real. They also knew that it was possible that they could identify Charlie by this if he ended up deceased. A body would be found on May 12th, a month and 12 days after Charlie's abduction, when a truck driver was just walking around in the woods and found a partially buried, very small body. But this body was badly decomposed and was only 4.5 miles from the Lindbergh residence. Due to this, it was quickly speculated that this was Charlie Lindbergh, and the autopsy revealed that his head had been crushed and there was a hole in his skull with some parts missing. The cause of death was determined to be a blow to the head, and the time of death was around the same day as the kidnapping. But the problem was they couldn't identify this baby because he was so badly decomposed. At this point, President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave the Bureau of Investigation full access to this case. They were also given exclusive jurisdiction as the federal government in handling all future cases. Now, the media and the public outcry forced U.S. Congress to also make a change, and this is when the Lindbergh Law, or the Federal Kidnapping Act, was passed, which would have been on Charles Jr.'s 2nd birthday. This would make kidnapping across state lines a federal crime and could be punishable by death. Now, investigators were trying to find a killer at this time, so they were going back and re-questioning a lot of people. And so a month later, Anne's mother's in-home waitress, who was named Violet Sharp, was under investigation for the murder. It was the 3rd time she was being questioned. However, before she could be, she ran upstairs and swallowed poison and took her own life. Afterwards, it was found that she was completely ruled out and would have been fine, but the pressure had gotten to her. All of the employees were being re-questioned, and they were feeling the pressure, but that wasn't the only one. John Condon, who had inserted himself inside the investigation, was also a suspect, although he had been helping investigators ever since the body was found, and he never stopped, and he had even transcribed every conversation he had with Cemetery John in order for investigators to have it to look at later on. It was also found that the woman named Evelyn, who had given that con man Gaston $100,000 to find Charlie, was never paid back, and the FBI had actually found that the fox that Gaston spoke about was the disbarred Washington attorney named Norman T. Whitaker. So Gaston was convicted of embezzlement and larceny after trust and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. And then Norman and Gaston were also convicted of conspiracy to defraud and sentenced to 2 years. However, they didn't actually have anything to do with Charlie's kidnapping. Investigators were looking into any possible theory. They had heard that a purple gang of Detroit could be involved, but they found nothing that connected them, and every boat registered as Nellie was searched, but there was no sign that Charlie had ever been held there. But then, a year after the kidnapping, 296 $10 gold certificates from the ransom money were deposited. It was believed that they were deposited by a J.J. Faulkner of 149th Street in the Bronx. However, this man was never found to be questioned. A year and a month after the kidnappings, these gold certificates were being forced to be exchanged for Federal Reserve notes. This was by the president. It wasn't just for this case, but it would be helpful because the ransom money used gold certificates that would need to be turned in, and so then they might just have a name. Like I said, it wasn't because of the Lindberghs. It was because they wanted to prevent the hoarding of gold during the Great Depression. But it would be the first breakthrough in this case in a long time. And New York City's service station attendant would write down a license plate because there was a man who came in and paid with a $10 gold certificate which weren't being used anymore. And they would find that this man was a German carpenter from the Bronx. He looked identical to Cemetery John, but that was not his name. His name was Bruno Hauptmann. The 35-year-old was tracked down and watched inside his home for that night. And when he came out that morning, on September 19th of 1934, he was arrested. They found another $20 gold certificate on him, and the serial numbers matched the ransom money. Then at his home, $13,000 in gold certificates were found in his garage hidden in a gas can. After having Bruno write a letter, it was found that the handwriting was consistent with those in the ransom notes. Bruno was found to have been in the country for 11 years, and he did have a criminal record for burglary. But Bruno said that the money wasn't even his, and he was holding it for a friend named Isidor Fitch, who had gone back to Germany the year after the kidnapping and then died there. Bruno was said to work as a carpenter up until the time of the kidnapping, when he just all of a sudden stopped working and began to trade in stocks. John Condon was brought in to pick Cemetery John out of a lineup where Bruno was one of the men. John Condon had continued to go to the police department looking through all sorts of criminal photos to try to find Cemetery John, and he had never seen him. But as soon as he walked into that lineup, he immediately picked Bruno. Then investigators brought in the taxi cab driver, Joseph Perron, who had delivered one of the ransom notes, and he too picked Bruno out of the lineup as the man who gave him the note. Bruno also drove a Dodge sedan, which was seen the day prior at the Lindberghs' home. On October 9th, 1934, 2 years after the kidnapping of baby Charlie, his abductor was finally arrested. Or was he? His trial began on January 3rd of 1935, and along with all of the evidence that led to his arrest, they also presented that the ladder found at the Lindbergh home had tool marks that were consistent with tools that were owned by Bruno. And he also had wood in his attic that had been cut up that matched the same wood as the ladder had. The most damning evidence was that they found John Condon's address and phone number written inside of his closet. Charles Lindbergh took the stand, and he said Bruno's voice was the same that he heard that night calling to John when he had taken John to the meeting. But Bruno testified that he was innocent, that he had been beaten by police and told that he had to redo his handwriting until it matched the ransom notes. He also said that he would have never made that homemade ladder because he was a carpenter. He would have done it better. Now, Charles Lindbergh sat at the prosecution table for his own son's murder with a gun in his suit jacket. They claimed that Charlie must have died from the fall when the ladder broke and when he and Bruno were coming down. After 5 weeks of trial and 11 hours of deliberation, Bruno was found guilty and sentenced to death. Bruno's lawyers immediately appealed to the Supreme Court of the state of New Jersey. However, this was denied. His death was planned for January 17th of 1936, but was pushed back 30 days to February 17th, and this was due to the governor believing that he was innocent. However, that day he would be resentenced to death for March 30th. Now, Bruno continued to deny any involvement and even refused to confess for a sum of $100,000 that would be given to his wife. However, on April 3rd of 1936 at 8:47 p.m., he would be electrocuted. He said he had nothing to confess, and his final words were, "You think when I die, it will be like a book I close, but the book, it will never close." The public, media, and the family were actually thrilled, though. A killer was caught and a baby got justice. Yet, at this time, a likely suspect was not questioned or even thought of. And as years went by, many began to question how solved this case really was. You see, although there seemed to be a lot of evidence against Bruno, it was believed to be mostly circumstantial, and many questions were unanswered. There was also the fact that investigators always believed that there was 2 or more men involved in this, but there was nobody that they could connect with Bruno. There was also another theory that popped up, that Charles Lindbergh was never suspected, not only because it was hard to believe that a father could pretend his own son was kidnapped after killing him, but because he was such a known individual and nobody wanted to accuse him of anything. Later, it would be shown by FBI statistics that over 70% of children under 9 who were killed by their parents. New Jersey Governor Harold Hoffman launched his own investigation at this point because he had so many doubts. He believed this couldn't have been done by one man and that it could be an inside job. Not long after this, the Lindberghs actually moved out of the country overnight. Now, upon some digging, it was found that Charles Lindbergh was supposed to be somewhere else the night of the abduction. That night, he was actually scheduled to speak at a banquet in his honor at New York University. He was said to be a man who never missed anything. He was always on schedule and extremely organized. He was almost anal about this kind of thing. However, when investigators asked him why he didn't go to this, why he didn't even tell them he wasn't going, he said he simply forgot. It was also well known that when investigators came into the home, it wasn't long before Charles was calling the shots. he was in charge, as though he had background in criminal justice. All investigators were said to be afraid of doing something wrong in the presence of a hero and knew that the public would be infuriated if they didn't find Charlie. So, Charles led the search for his son, up from the time that first ransom letter was found up until Martha's Vineyard when they were looking for the boat Nellie. But like I told you, when Charles received the information that his son was in Massachusetts, he didn't immediately go there. Instead, he drove to the home with the Treasury agents, and some believe this was weird, that he wouldn't immediately go to the place where the son he had been looking for could be. But there were many times in his life that Charles acted strange. In fact, before marrying Anne, he had actually dated her sister Elizabeth and then dumped her a few months later to marry Anne. But the strangest part of Charles' history was when he entered his wife's, Anne's, family. Her younger sister would then get a ransom note. This was Constance, and she would be told that unless the family paid $50,000, she would be abducted and killed. They were to put the money in a special wooden box and drop it off in a cemetery. Sound familiar? They never found who that threat was from either. But after Charlie had passed, around 20 years later, Charles would end up going to Germany and having children, 5 different children born by different mothers while he was still married. The man who was once deemed a hero that could do no wrong was then kind of looked down upon at this time for the strange things that he began to do. But that weekend of the abduction, no one would have known besides the servants and the family that they were there. Like I said, they went back to Anne's mother's home every single week. It was hard to even find this home. It was extremely isolated in the woods. So who would have known that this home would be where Charlie was, where the home was, and also what bedroom he would be in? Someone who knew the family well. Now that night, what I did not tell you was that Charles allegedly told everyone in the home not to disturb Charlie between the hours of 8 and 10 while he was asleep in the nursery. That was the same time he would be taken. Charles also arrived home at 8:25 p.m. and honked loudly, and he normally never did this. Betty the nurse also thought when Charlie went missing that Charles was just playing a practical joke and had Charlie all along, because Charles was known for these jokes. He was a practical joke kind of guy. And during his piloting days, he actually had a roommate that he switched his water that he had with kerosene. And this man almost died. These practical jokes weren't the funny, just, a shocking kind of joke. They were sometimes disturbing and almost deadly. A few weeks before the kidnapping, he had even pretended that Charlie was missing by hiding him in a closet. He had all of the servants searching for hours before telling them it was a joke. However, even though Charles had done this all of his life, after the kidnapping of his baby, he no longer played a practical joke ever again. Now, when Betty had told Charles that his son was gone, Charles went to Anne and said, "They have stolen our baby," even though there was no evidence that this was, a kidnapping yet, or that it was done by multiple people. He was also the only one who noticed that the ransom note was on the windowsill, and he also refused to open it till investigators got there. Now, it is said today by handwriting experts that the first note out of the 13 was written differently and appeared to be under duress. But when investigators got to the property that day, Charles wasted no time telling them what to do, and he threatened to shoot any of them who didn't listen to him. He even gave this ransom note that was so important to the investigation to the New York Mafia to show around in the gang to see if anyone owned up to this. Now, like I told you, investigators didn't have eyes on the cemetery when they were having the first meeting with Cemetery John, and it wasn't because investigators didn't want to. They wanted to see if they could follow him back or, just see who this man was, but Charles told them not to go. Now, when Charlie was found, Charles was the one to go and identify him. And he looked at the decomposed body that no one else could identify and said, "I am perfectly satisfied that this is my child." And then Charlie was cremated immediately. There was also the question of why the waitress with Anne's mother's family who was found to have nothing to do with the actual murder, had taken her life just because the police got close. Did she know something she shouldn't have? Did she tell someone something that she shouldn't have? It was also found that Bruno had an alibi for the night of the abduction that everyone just pretended not to hear. He was said by a few different witnesses to have picked up his wife 2 hours away from the Lindbergh's home in a Bronx bakery she worked at, and he did this every night. Now, although the sketch did sort of match Bruno, the profile of this intruder really didn't. Bruno was happily married with a son and many friends. He was a very social man, but the profile said it was an antisocial loner dissatisfied with life. Bruno's lawyer showed up to the trial many times hungover, not even helping Bruno at all, and Bruno's wife did end up, after the execution, doing interviews, and one in 1992, she began pleading with Anne Lindbergh to reveal the truth, because when the truth was revealed, she could die the next day in peace. Now, Bruno's wife's lawyer said that this was the trial of the century, but it was also probably the greatest fraud in the history of this country. Now, authors and experts have gone back and forth for years between the evidence against Bruno that was overwhelming and saying that it was also completely manufactured by police. There have even been grown men who have come forward saying, Charlie wasn't killed, I am Charlie. But, of course, this can't be confirmed nor denied. The body of Charles Jr. was cremated and DNA tests couldn't be done, nor even a full autopsy before the family just went ahead and cremated his body. The Lindbergh family has granted 0 interviews, and those who, lived during the time of the trial or were involved, most of them have passed away in this time. But author Gregory Algreen and Stephen Monnier began to write a book, and they had this theory that Charles was trying to play a practical joke that night that went horribly wrong. That he had driven home that night, he had grabbed this makeshift ladder that he had created, and he was going to grab Charlie from the nursery and then bring him to the front door and shock everyone with the fact that he was able to get this child while he was sleeping and no one knew how. However, they theorized that this ladder broke on the way down, Charlie fell to his death, and Charles decided he had to cover it up. He then arrived home after he buried the body, and that is when he began honking his horn to let them know that he was there. Then he faked his own son's kidnapping so he didn't have to confess to what he had done. However, upon looking through this case, these authors did realize that Bruno did have the money, and so that did give him a motive. But they also found that during the trial, there was this high school student named Ben Lupisa who had come forward to say that he had seen a man on that road where the Lindberghs lived with a ladder in his car. It was just a few hours before the kidnapping in Hopewell, but he was not used as a witness, and no one wanted to talk to him at all. These authors found him so many years later, and he was a retired chemist, more than willing to talk, and he said no one had ever wanted to interview him before. Ben said that he was getting mail that day from the mailbox when a New Jersey plated car pulled around him to pass him. And he said the guy was wearing a fedora, but he didn't see exactly what he looked like other than the fact that he was white. But the point was, Bruno lived in New York and would have New York license plate. Charles Lindbergh, however, lived in New Jersey. Ben said that he also thought the car had a very distinctive grille and no hood ornament, which matched Charles' car. But after their book, Crime of the Century, was published, Charles Lindbergh's daughter, named Reeve, said that her father had a great sense of humor, but to suggest that he was capable of murder was unthinkable. In the novel Beneath the Winter Sycamores by Jim Bombs, he has a theory that Charlie was actually physically disabled and Charles arranged the kidnapping to move the baby to Germany so they didn't have to deal with him. It was known that Charlie had been born and he had to immediately eat a very strict diet, and he had an unusually big head. He also couldn't stand up straight. But there were also other theories not even involving Charles. This one included a group of 3 men thought to be the killers. A year prior to the kidnapping in the Bronx, a little boy named Gene Jorn, who was only 15 years old, would be at an amusement park with one of his neighbors, who was a grown man named John Knoll, as well as John's younger brother, Walter Knoll, and another German-speaking man named Bruno. Now, Gene Zorn overheard them talking about a place called Englewood, New Jersey, and this was the same location where Anne Lindbergh's mother lived. But Gene Zorn was 15 and he had not heard anything about the Lindbergh kidnapping, so he didn't think much of this. It wasn't until many years later that he picked up this magazine, began reading about this abduction, and everything seemed to connect in his head, especially the name Bruno, the same name of the man who had been executed for this crime. This article was saying that they believed Bruno had accomplices, one of them being named John, but they couldn't find them anywhere. Gene Zorn then began to believe that he had overheard a kidnapping plan, because one of the men that he had overheard was named John and matched the description of Cemetery John as well. He also had large discolored thumbs, as John Condon had said that Cemetery John had. Yet John Condon claimed that it was Bruno and not John Knoll that he met with. Since reading this article and really believing that he knew the real killers, Gene Zorn began trying to inform investigators, get something done about this, and once he died, his son Bob actually continued trying to do so. However, at this point, this is just yet another theory in quite a convoluted case. And Bruno Hauptmann was also said to go by Richard most of his life, and it was believed that Gene Zorn's Bruno must have been a different man because he wouldn't have gone by Bruno. However, that can't be confirmed nor denied that he never went by Bruno at all. And if the Bruno who was executed didn't know these other two men, then there was no reason to really connect them to everyone else in this case, just because they were talking about Inglewood around the same time of the abduction. Ultimately, there are just so many questions. What do you believe happened in this case? Because it seems that no one can really come together and decide what the truth is, because we just probably will never know, unfortunately. It seems like a likely theory to me that this was an inside job, or that somebody inside informed somebody else who ended up doing this, because there was just no way that people would know. I mean, the Lindberghs were extremely private due to their huge media circus that was always around them. I mean, they were famous. They were probably as popular as, royalty, Kardashians, celebrities at this time, and they went to great lengths to be private. And so they weren't just going to go around and tell the public or anybody what they were doing and why they were doing it. So how did somebody know they were going to be there that day and exactly where Charlie was going to be as well? It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that a random man named Bruno would know all of this information and pull it off all by himself. Now, the Lindbergh's home in Hopewell has since been turned over to the state for $1 and then was turned into a juvenile justice program. But please leave me any of your theories down below. Do you believe it was Bruno? I mean, he was convicted and executed for it, so that makes me want it to be him, because otherwise an innocent man was killed for a crime he didn't commit. But I don't know, there's just so many elements to this case that don't add up, and it really, really makes you wonder. A huge thing for me is the fact that not long before his son was kidnapped, he was pretending his son was kidnapped, and he thought that that was funny. And the fact that even before that, when he came into his wife's family's life, her younger sister began to be threatened to be abducted and killed for the same amount of money, and everything was just exactly the same as what would happen to his own son many years later. There are just too many correlations here with Charles that makes you think, but no one wanted to point a finger at him because he was America's hero. But America's hero could have been a killer and could have gotten away with it as well. Let me know, but don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.